Between May 1st and May 12th, our air regiment in Leh did not lose a single airplane in numerous battles. We made good use of the inability of enemy pilots to maintain constant vigilance while in the air. The superiority of our pilots in flying skill enabled us to win continuous victories. On May 13th, damage to my fighter forced me to stay on the ground. I was able to read in peace the letters for the whole month, which that morning were delivered by submarine. Mother wrote that my brothers were now also at war. One had tried to enter a naval flight school, but had failed, and was now serving at the Sasebo naval base. The other brother was drafted into the army and has already gone to China. He never came home again. Later he was transferred to Burma, where he was killed in action. But the most eagerly awaited letter came, of course, from Fujiko. She detailed the great changes that had taken place in their home. Most surprising was the news that she was now also working in her uncle's firm, which had become a munitions factory. The Prime Minister said that no one should be idle now. He said that even women who would not agree to contribute voluntarily to the country's war effort would be drafted and sent to ammunition factories where their labour was needed. So my uncle, so that I would not be torn away from my family, immediately arranged to work for 405 himself. I was simply amazed. Fujiko, who came from such a respected family, working in an ammunition factory. It was hard to imagine how my mother managed our farm without the help of my two brothers. After all, it was hard even when we were all at home. My cousin Hatsuo reported even more startling news. She wrote that her father had been transferred from Shikoku back to Tokyo. A few days after his return on April 18th, she saw with her own eyes the raid on Tokyo by American Army B-25 bombers. Hatsuo wrote, "I know that you are in the thick of the battle, and your success in battles with the enemy, we are all very happy." The bombing of Tokyo and several other cities has dramatically changed the attitude of our people to the war. Everything has changed dramatically as the bombs fell on our homes. The difference between the front and the back seems to be blurring. I know that I, like the other girls, will have to work harder and harder here to help you and the other pilots so far away from Japan. Hatsuo was still in school, but for the afternoon and part of the evening the schoolgirls worked in a garment factory producing military uniforms. The sudden change in the family was startling. My brothers in the military, Fujiko at the munitions factory, Hatsuo at the garment factory. It was all so strange. Hatsuo didn't describe the enemy bombardment in detail, although it was the first time the enemy attacked our islands. Of course, we in Leh had gotten word of it much earlier, actually on the same day. Officially, the authorities denied any serious destruction, which seemed plausible given the small number of planes involved in the attack. But this report made literally all the pilots stationed at Leh nervous. To learn that the enemy was strong enough to strike our homeland was not pleasant. Yes, this raid was no more than a pin 406 prick, but there were serious fears that in the future will begin much more powerful attacks. I was still reading the letters when Warrant Officer Wataru Handa came up to me and asked for my wingman to join him on a reconnaissance flight over Port Moresby. Warrant Officer Handa had just recently arrived in Leh, which we were all glad about. He had not fought in the Pacific, but was one of the most famous Japanese aces to have fought in China. Handa was credited with 15 enemy airplanes shot down. After returning from China, he served as an instructor at the Tsushira Flight School. I saw no reason why Honda should not have been allowed to fly with him. Wataru Handa would surely become one of our best pilots in the future. However, Honda looked at it all completely differently. Veteran or not, he began to argue. "I don't want to fly with him, Saburo. I've only flown with you and I have absolutely no desire to change anything," he grumbled. I shouted, "Shut up, you fool. Handa is a better pilot than me. He's flown a lot more. You will fly with him." At noon, Honda, along with 5 other Zero pilots, left on a reconnaissance flight to Port Moresby. I was angered that Honda was unwilling to fly and waited for his return. 2 hours later, 5 Zeros landed at the airfield. Warrant Officer Handa and 4 other pilots returned. Honda was not among them. I ran to the runway and jumped onto the wing of Handa's fighter before it even came to a complete stop. "Where's Honda? Where is he? What happened to him?" I shouted. Handa looked at me sadly. Where is he? What happened? I insisted. Handa climbed out of the cabin. On the ground, he took my hands and bowed low, then spoke with obvious effort. His voice trembled. I'm sorry, Saburo. I'm very sorry. Honda is dead. It's my fault. 407. I was numb. I couldn't believe it. Not Honda. He was the best wingman I'd ever had to fly with. Warrant Officer Honda tried not to look me in the eye. He was stubbornly looking at the ground and had already started moving toward the command center. I followed him, unable to utter a word, and he guiltily continued. We were over Port Moresby and started circling at 7,000 feet. It seemed to us that there were no enemy planes in the sky, so I started looking for planes on the ground. That was my mistake. I didn't spot these fighter planes. They were P-39s, just a few of them. They swooped down so fast that we didn't have time to react. We didn't even realize they were there until they opened fire. I immediately executed a U-turn, as did my wingman Endo. When I looked back for a moment, I saw that Honda's airplane, which was also part of my trio, was engulfed in flames. He was caught in the crossfire of the P-39s. I stopped and looked at him. Handa walked away. He never seemed to forgive himself for losing my wingman. Although Handa had become an ace in China, he had squandered his skills during this walking war. He never once encountered American fighters who dive much better than our airplanes. Whatever actually happened there, Handa blamed himself for the death of my wingman. All the time he was stationed at Leh, he walked slumped and pale. Eventually he contracted tuberculosis and was sent home. Many years later I received a letter from his wife. My husband passed away yesterday after a prolonged illness. I am writing this letter fulfilling his last will and asking you to forgive him. He never was able to recover from the loss of your pilot in Leh. His last words before he passed away were, "All my life I fought bravely." 408. But I cannot forgive myself that in Leh I lost the pilot Sakai. When Honda died, he was only 20 years old. He was a strong man and behaved that way both on the ground and in the air. Honda was a bully, but still in Sasasai Squadron he was loved. I was proud of him. His performance as a wingman was excellent. I was quite sure he would soon become an ace as well. Until the evening I wandered around the base, unable to see anything, as if in a fog. I paid no attention to the other pilots of the squadron, who were eager to avenge the first pilot killed since April 17th. One of my most significant achievements I considered that I had not lost a single wingman in combat, and now I sent Honda against his own wishes with another wingman, and he was dead. I was not at all comforted by the fact that my other wingman, Yonekawa, could have been killed as well. For quite some time now, Yonekawa had been flying with me, safely covering me, though he had not managed to score a single victory in the process. Honda was more aggressive and shot down several airplanes. It was then that I firmly decided Yonekawa should have his own victories. The next day, May 14th, I was given Naval Aviator 3rd Class Hattori as wingman in place of the dead Honda. Before the 7 fighters took off to head for Port Moresby, I took Yonekawa aside and told him that in case of an encounter with enemy fighters, he should take my place and I would cover him. Yonekawa's face flashed with excitement. If I had known what awaited us that day, I would still have done the same. The Allied pilots seemed to have well understood the exceptional maneuverability of the Zero fighter, and today they decided to try out the new tactic for the first time. We saw enemy fighters over Port Moresby, but unlike previous engagements, they did not form into one large group. Instead, the enemy planes broke into pairs and triplets and scattered 409 all over the sky. Their actions were confusing. If we turned to the left, we would be attacked from above and to the right, and so on. If they wanted to confuse us, they completely succeeded. The only thing we could do to counter them was to act the same way. I flew up to Sasai's plane and signaled to him that I would take care of the next pair of fighters. He nodded, and I pulled away, seeing the lieutenant ordering the other 4Os to pair up. We split into 3 groups and went towards the enemy. We attacked the 2 P-39s I had selected, and I gave a line from a range of 100 yards. The first American dodged my shells and flipped over the wing into a steep dive. I had no chance of catching up and destroying him. The second airplane was already turning over the wing to start dive when I made a steep turn to the left, turned over and went into his tail. For a moment I recognized the surprised face of the pilot, who had just now discovered me. The P-39 jerked backward, then dropped back onto its left wing, intending to dive. This was very good for Yamakawa, who clung to my tail as if glued. I waved him off and turned to the right, leaving the P-39 to my wingman. Yamakawa rushed at the Airacobra like a madman, and I stayed 200 yards behind him. The P-39 jerked, trying to make a left turn and evade Yamakawa's fire. But he took advantage of the enemy's loss of speed and turned slightly, reducing the distance between the planes to 50 yards. For the next couple of minutes, the fighters looked like two angry cats clashing. They twisted and turned, together they made loops and spirals, but Yamakawa firmly clung to the tail of the enemy and blocked all avenues of escape. However, the enemy pilot made the grave mistake of stopping to dive. He had every chance to get away, and now that Yamakawa was almost close to him, an attempt to go into a dive would simply expose him to 410 guns 0. From an altitude of 13,000 feet, the planes gradually descended to 3,000 feet. However, the enemy pilot did not lose his head. He could not shake the Zero off its tail, but endeavoured to pull it back toward the Port Moresby airfield to expose it to anti-aircraft fire. It was by no means a one-sided battle. The P-39 pilot manoeuvred brilliantly, even though the pursuer's aircraft outnumbered his own. The Airacobra and the Zero resembled spinning dervishes. Both fired short bursts, but neither pilot achieved a decisive hit. But little by little it became clear that Yamakawa was gaining the upper hand. On each turn he won a second or two, going into the tail of the Airacobra. The planes skimmed over Port Moresby and continued their duel over the dense thickets. Hattori came over to me, and we gained altitude, circling slowly over the fighting planes. By now they were over the very tops of the trees. The Airacobra no longer had room to go into a spiral, and could only fly horizontally. When the American leveled off, Yamakawa opened fire. We had no doubts about his marksmanship, and soon the P-39 crashed into the jungle. Yamakawa had won his first victory. For 3 months, May, June, July, there were almost continuous air battles. Only after the war one learned that the fighters of the Lei Air Regiment achieved the greatest success among all Japanese fighter units. No one else managed to win victories as regularly. Lei had become a veritable hornet's nest for the enemy. Although Rabaul served as a major base for our bombers and ships, it could not boast of having destroyed as many enemy planes between mid-April and mid-August. We flew the most remarkable fighter aircraft fought in the Pacific Theatre. Our pilots were markedly superior to the enemy pilots in skill, and many of us had gained a great deal of experience during the war in China, as well as during the grueling and rigorous training prior to the war in Japan. It was not surprising, therefore, that the enemy suffered heavy losses in the battles against the Zeros operating out of Lei. But we were all sure that the courage of the crews flying the B-25 Mitchell and B-26 Marauder bombers deserved the highest praise. These twin-engine planes lacked firepower and armour protection like the heavy flying fortresses. However, time after time these planes made raids on Lei and other targets, without fighter escort, 418 which our High Command considered absolutely mandatory for the protection of bombers. They always flew at low altitude, no more than 1,500 feet off the ground. In doing so they literally glided between the treetops, as we saw for ourselves more than once. The enemy pilots had courage and good flying skills, but unfortunately for them, their planes could not compete in maneuverability with the Zero. Nevertheless, although the Allies suffered heavy losses from the strikes of Zero, only a few times we managed to thwart their attacks. Their pilots knew no fear. Time after time they came back and bombed our airfield. Bombs fell on Lei day and night, and the gunners fired at everything that moved. The morale of the enemy pilots was very high, although in the spring and summer of 1942, we literally weeded them out. On May 23rd, 7 Zeros intercepted 5 B-25s over Lei. One of them was shot down over the sea 30 miles south of Salamoa. The next day, 6 bombers returned to attack Lei again. Unfortunately for the Allies, our shore observers spotted them while still far from Lei, and 11 Japanese fighters attacked the helpless bombers. We set fire to and shot down 5 planes and severely damaged a 6th. I participated in both of these battles, and official Imperial State documents credit me with destroying 3 bombers in 2 days. Toward the end of May, the intensity of the raids increased. On May 25th, 4 B-17s attacked Leh for the first time with fighter escort. They were covered by 20 fighters. Over the Owen Stanley Ridge, like hell opened up when 16 Zeros attacked the Allies. 5 enemy fighters were shot down, but all the fortresses survived. 3 days later, 5 unescorted B-26 bombers flew in to bomb Leh. I scored another victory. On June 9th, I sent 2 more B-26s into the ocean. The days were like 2 drops of water. Life turned into endless sorties to hunt, escort 419 bombers to Port Moresby, and frantic running to the fighters, standing on the ground to hastily take off to intercept the approaching bombers. The Allies seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of airplanes. Each week brought them new heavy losses, but the planes returned in 2s, 3s and 10s. Years later, the details of these battles faded in my memory, although I carefully keep my diaries. But I remember several episodes quite clearly. The May 24th battle was unforgettable. The air raid alarm alerted everyone in Leh. The 6 fighter planes on duty stood ready to take off. The rest of the pilots jumped over the sides of the moving truck that brought them from the barracks to the airfield. We took off instantly, with literally not a second to lose. My own fighter got off the ground the moment a series of bombs ploughed over the runway, right behind its tail. At least 11 Zeros were in the air as 6 B-25s completed their bombing run and turned around to scoot off to Port Moresby. Nishizawa and Ota were the first to catch up with them, and each attacked a bomber, showering them with cannon shells. Within seconds, both Mitchells caught fire. They crashed very close to our runway. Our other fighters pounced on the 4 bombers, which, skillfully maneuvering, dodged the shells and left towards the sea. 11 Japanese fighters rushed in pursuit. Near Salamaua, we again went on the attack, and again showed the inability of our pilots to act together. Each pilot thought only about himself and fought his own battle. He threw himself at the bombers, completely ignoring his comrades. Zero indiscriminately spinning, almost ramming each other. More than once our pilot had to frantically dodge a line that another Zero released in the direction of the bombers. 420. Once the B-25s were over the sea, they pressed onto the water itself, gliding no more than 10 yards above the surface. Their tactics were clear. We could not dive too steeply and could not attack them from below. One pilot who tried to dive on the lead bomber misjudged the distance and crashed into the water at full speed. I fired on the trailing bomber, passing just above its tail. The B-25s were flying in a straight line, so I had no trouble concentrating fire on the fuselage. In a matter of moments, flames flickered in the air, smoke billowed. The bomber jerked sharply to the left and exploded, falling into the sea. At sea level, the B-25 had almost the same speed as the Zero, so we could hardly keep up with the enemy, because we also had to make approaches, firing at the Mitchells. 3 enemy planes were still in the air when our 6 fighters on duty turned back, having used up all their ammunition. LT. Sasai shot down the 4th bomber, and we continued to strafe the surviving pair. I shot down the 5th when apparently its gunners had also used up their ammunition, and the bomber turned straight for Port Moresby. Mitchell took about 1,000 bullets to the fuel tank, his right wing engulfed in flames. It jerked haphazardly and crashed into the water, exploding. It was a good day. We reliably destroyed 5 out of 6 bombers. A few days later, I was introduced to another aspect of air warfare that I found horrifying, even though I had already been in many battles. I caught a single B-26 over Leh, drove it into the sea, and riddled its fuselage and right wing. Marauder caught fire, but before it collapsed into the sea, 4 men managed to jump out with parachutes. Each landed safely on the water, and the next moment a small, brightly coloured life raft flashed there. As I circled over it, I saw the pilots, 421, clinging to the sides. Since they were only 2 miles from Leh, our boat was free to pick up the enemy pilots and take them prisoner. Suddenly, one of the pilots raised his arms above his head and disappeared into the water. The others began furiously pounding the water with their hands and tried to climb onto the raft. Sharks, It seemed to me that there were 30 or 40 of them. Then the second man disappeared. As I went lower and lower, I thought I saw the glint of teeth clamped on the third man's arm. The only survivor, a large bald man, was clinging to the raft with one hand and frantically waving a knife clutched in the other. But he, too, was dead. When our speedboat returned to Leh, the sailors reported that they found only an empty, bloody raft. Not even a shred of clothing remained of the 4 pilots. A tropical downpour on May 15th brought all the pilots a day of rest. However, the rest was short, because already on May 16th before dawn several B-25s attacked the airfield. They flew at treetop level, covered the runway with bombs and shelled the repair shops. For the second day in a row we sat on the ground as it took all day to fill in the craters and prepare the airfield. We sat around the barracks, a few pilots dozing, the rest of us discussing the increased intensity of enemy raids. Our group was joined by a bomber pilot who had landed in Leh to refuel and was also confined to the ground after the raid. He listened with interest to our stories of enemy bomber attacks. Then he looked enviously at the Zeros parked on the walkway. "You know, I always dreamed of flying a fighter plane, not that truck they put me on," he said suddenly. And then sighed, "We're taking more and more casualties during raids. Most of us are sure they'll never come home." "I think so too." Then he turned to us. "But I would be completely satisfied if I could manage to do one thing." We waited to see what he would say. He suddenly smiled. "I'd like to do a dead loop on that truck I fly. Can you imagine what it would look like?" One of the Zero pilots politely remarked, "If I were you, I wouldn't even try. You'll never get out of the loop entirely, even if you do manage to loop it." "I think so too," the bomber pilot nodded. We watched him as he walked across the airfield and climbed into the cockpit of the fighter. There he sat for a while, studying the controls. We had no idea then that we would all remember this pilot for the rest of our lives. The day stretched slowly, and in the evening Nishizawa, Ota and I went to the radio room to listen to the musical hour that the Australians broadcast daily. Suddenly Nishizawa said this music. "Listen to it. It's Dane Macabre, the Dance of Death, isn't it?" We nodded. Nishizawa exclaimed, "That gave me an idea. You know we have to fly to bombard Port Moresby tomorrow, right? Why don't we do a little dance of death ourselves?" Ota snorted, "What kind of nonsense are you talking about? You must be out of your mind." Nishizawa protested, "No, it's fine. Before we fly home, let the 3 of us go back and do some demonstration loops over Port Moresby airfield. They on the ground will just go nuts over it." Ota cautiously remarked it might be fun, but what will the commander say? He'd never authorize us to do something like that. This was followed by a nonchalant reply, "Would he? Who says he has to know about it?" And Nishizawa smiled broadly. We went to the barracks and there we whispered our plans for tomorrow. We were not afraid to appear over Port Moresby with just the 3 of us, for we had shot down a total of 65 planes. I had 27 to my credit, Nishizawa had 20, and Ota shot down 18. The next day we attacked Port Moresby with a maximum force of 18 Zeros. The group was personally commanded by Lieutenant Captain Tadashi Nakajima. Nishizawa and I were his wingmen. Suddenly it turned out that there was nothing to fire at the airfield. The enemy reliably camouflaged all the bombers on the airfield. But in the air everything was different. There were 3 groups of enemy fighters over the airfield. We turned to the first group and went into a frontal attack. In the ensuing battle, 6 P-39s crashed to the ground, engulfed in flames, with 2 of them shot down by me. Several Zeros came out of the battle to shell the airfield, which ended badly for them. 2 planes, badly damaged, crashed on the spurs of Owen Stanley Ridge on the way back. After the scramble, we regrouped. As soon as the group assembled, I signalled to LT. CMDR. Nakajima that I intended to catch up with the enemy aircraft. He waved his hand, giving permission, and I flipped into a gentle dive. I returned to Port Moresby a few minutes later and began circling the airfield at 12,000 feet. The anti-aircraft guns were silent, and there were no enemy fighters in sight. Then 2 more Zeros appeared, flying at my altitude. and we formed up. Nishizawa and Ota smiled as I waved hello to them. We huddled together so that there were only a few feet between the tips of our wings. I slid the lantern back and used my finger to describe a circle above my head, then raised 3 fingers. Both pilots raised their hands as a sign that they understood. We were to perform 3 loops in a single formation. One last glance back to make sure there were no enemy fighters nearby, and I tilted the nose of the airplane to pick up speed. Nishizawa and Ota followed on my heels. I took the handle, and the Zero responded obediently, making an upward arc, gradually tipping onto its back. The other 2 fighters followed beside me, and together we did a perfect dead loop. Twice more we went up, flipped over on our backs, dive-bombed and completed the loop. Not a single gun from the ground fired, and the air was still completely empty. As I came out of the 3rd loop, Nishizawa brought his plane close and, smiling happily, signaled that he wanted to continue. I turned to the left. A chuckling Ota nodded strenuously in agreement. I couldn't resist the temptation. We dropped to 6,000 feet and repeated the 3 loops, still holding together. We should have been over our own airfield by now. But I thought of the people gawking at us from below and laughed merrily. We returned to Leh and landed 20 minutes behind the other fighters. We didn't tell anyone what we were doing. But as soon as we got together, we immediately laughed out loud. Ota was just bent over with laughter, and even the usually scowling Nishizawa clapped us on the backs excitedly. However, we couldn't keep our prank a secret for long. Sometime after 9 p.m., a resident came running into our barracks and said that Lieutenant Sasai wanted to see us. Immediately, we looked at each other but were not surprised. After the circus that had been set up, the punishment could be serious. As soon as we entered Sasai's room, the lieutenant jumped to his feet and yelled at us, "Look at this, you stupid assholes." Look at this, his face flushed red. He was only holding back with great difficulty. Sasai waved a letter in front of our faces in English. He hissed, "Do you know what this is?" "No." "Then I'll tell you, you idiots. It was dropped on our base a few minutes ago by an enemy plane." The letter read, "To the commander of Leh Air Base. We were very impressed with the 3 pilots who visited us today. We all enjoyed the dead loops performed over our airfield. It was an amazing sight to see. We would appreciate it if the same pilots would visit us again. Have them wrap green scarves around their necks. We are very sorry we could not greet them properly, but next time we promise them the warmest welcome." After hearing all this, we involuntarily laughed. The letter was signed by a group of fighter pilots from Port Moresby. Lieutenant Sasai continued to rage and gave us an irritated lecture regarding our idiotic behavior. We were admonished not to make future demonstrations over enemy airfields. But it was a good joke, and we were perfectly happy with the Dane Macabre performed over Port Moresby. That evening, however, none of us suspected that the next day the real dance of death would begin, performed without any pretense. 7 Zeros of our regiment escorted 8 bombers to attack Port Moresby. Barely had we arrived at the enemy base when 18 enemy fighters descended on us from all sides. It was the first defensive battle I was forced to fight. We were exhausted trying to protect our bombers from the enemy planes. Although I drove the fighters away from the bombers several times, I was unable to shoot anyone down. The rest of our pilots shot down 3 Allied fighters. Meanwhile, our bombers dropped their bombs, although not too accurately. After that, they turned sharply to fly home. We saw the P-30s swooping down on the bombers at tremendous speed, but we simply did not have time to do anything to thwart this attack. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. Airacobra put a cannon round into the trailing bomber, performed a flip and dive away. The bomber burst into flames. The airplane looked familiar to me, and I flew closer. Yes, it was the same Betty that had landed at our place in Leh, and we had talked to its pilot in our barracks. The airplane pecked its nose and slid down. The fire was already raging. It was losing altitude rapidly and seemed to lose control. At 6,000 feet, everything happens rapidly. The flames had already engulfed the wings and fuselage. Suddenly, the flaming bomber lifted its nose and began to gain altitude. I stared at it in amazement as the pilot began to perform a dead loop. It was a completely impossible maneuver for the Betty. The pilot, the same one who had said he wanted to do a loop on the bomber, began to turn the airplane over. The bomber froze at the top point of the loop and suddenly exploded into a ball of fire. The blazing mass plummeted downward. Just before falling to the ground followed a new, even stronger explosion. This fire got to the fuel tanks. May 20, we held the highest altitude battle in history. On that day, Lieutenant Commander Nakajima led 15 Zeros to Port Moresby at an altitude of 30,000 feet. The flight took 1 hour and 20 minutes. All the way we persistently gained altitude. The calculation was simple. The higher altitude would give us the advantage of surprise, but it was with great amazement that we saw a group of enemy fighters a few miles away at the same altitude. I was very doubtful that the Zero would be able to perform aerobatics at that altitude. My personal altitude record on the Zero was 3,720 feet, but I was flying with an oxygen mask and an electrically heated jacket. At this altitude, the airplane responds very poorly to the control stick and absolutely refuses to climb even one more foot. Therefore, it was extremely unwise to engage the Zero at 30,000 feet. We encountered 10 enemy fighters, obviously new model P-39s. I went on the attack and immediately fired on one. The other 14 Zeros also went into a frontal attack on the enemy. In thin air, the fighter did not listen well to the rudders and ailerons. When the other fighters approached, I tried to take a favorable position for firing. We were moving as if in a slow-motion movie. I steeply spiraled closer and closer to the enemy, expecting to finish him off with a short burst, but I pulled the control stick too hard. I felt something hit me in the chest, and my oxygen mask slipped down to my chin. Fearing I would lose control of the airplane, I flailed helplessly in the cockpit. And then everything went black in front of my eyes. I lost consciousness. It seems that a person who concentrates all his strength to perform some action, even after losing consciousness from lack of oxygen, continues to do what he has planned. I felt that even after losing consciousness, my hands continued to clutch the control stick, forcing the airplane to make the intended downward spiral. When my head cleared and I began to make sense of my surroundings again, I was at 20,000 feet, and the airplane was responding obediently to every movement of my hand. I immediately executed a U-turn, as there was a high probability that an Aerocobra was following me down, trying to shoot me down. But the other airplane was also in a dangerous position. Probably the pilot had performed too sharp a maneuver at high altitude and went into a corkscrew, or he too was suffering from lack of oxygen. Whatever the reason, the American airplane was at the same altitude, descending in a slow corkscrew. I gave throttle and headed toward him, just as the enemy pilot came to his senses. The next instant, one wing of the P-39 bolted upward, and the Cobra rushed at me, firing all of its machine guns. But the Zero was back in its element. I came out of the turn and the Aerocobra was above me, and just to the right. One shot burst from the cannons, and the enemy fighter broke in half. Only one other Japanese pilot that day managed to score a victory. Ota also managed to shoot down an Aerocobra. The next day I managed to shoot down an enemy fighter without firing a single shot in a battle that unfolded quite differently than a fight between fighters at super high altitude. On May 26th, we gave chase of the enemy at treetop level. Flying out in a group of 16 Zeros, we encountered a rather strange enemy group. 4 B-17s flew in column, and about 20 fighters lined up in echelons of 2 or 3 planes around the fortresses. We were below the enemy planes and suddenly attacked them, gaining altitude steeply. I set one P-39 on fire, and soon a frenzied merry-go-round of fighters were spinning in the sky, chasing each other in separate bouts. Most of the enemy fighters went down, breaking away from the bombers. However, a few machines had to stop diving to avoid crashing into the ground. In this case, they were to start maneuvering in a horizontal plane. At least we hoped so. I sat on the tail of the P-39 just above the trees. The pilot was completely fearless. He spun, literally shaving off branches and almost clinging to mountain peaks. The enemy maneuvered desperately, trying to shake me off his tail. But each time he executed a slide or a turn, I inexorably shortened the distance. I gave a short burst from which the Aerocobra dodged, turning sharply to the left. In the next instant, its pilot spiraled steeply, diving into the treacherous valley, sliding close to the sheer cliffs. Before I realized what I was doing, I too was in the mountain pass very close to the P-39. Now it was no longer a matter of shooting. I could shoot down the enemy fighter, which was spinning and wiggling between the rocks. But I completely forgot about him for a while. I had to think about my own salvation. I was soaking wet. The roar of the engine sounded louder and louder. Rocks and stones flashed dangerously close to the Zero's wings as I raced through the narrow gorge at several hundred miles an hour. And then a mountain suddenly grew in the path of the enemy plane. The P-39 had just come out of a steep turn, and immediately a huge sheer cliff appeared right in front of it. The Airacobra pilot instinctively jerked the control stick to himself and tried to perform a turn to avoid the obstacle. But he didn't do it fast enough. The wing caught on the rocks and the airplane exploded with a terrible rumbling sound that reverberated through the gorge. The wreckage flew toward me, and I, too, grabbed the control stick and pulled as hard as I could. The Zero went up steeply, and for a split second I thought I was about to suffer the same fate as the unfortunate Airacobra. But the Zero obeyed the rudders, and I leaped over the cliff, missing it by inches. It took me a few minutes to regain consciousness and wipe the sweat running down my face. I dropped the throttle and began to slowly gain altitude, trying to relax. I was still shaking from the exertion. This was my 37th victory. Although I didn't take a single shot, it was one of my most exciting aerial duels. I later learned that Nishizawa and Ota had done almost the same thing that day. They drove two P-39s into the mountains where they crashed. Our pilots survived by doing crazy turns. In the evening, the barracks was filled with fun as we celebrated our incredible victories. In the last week of May, the Leh Air Regiment conducted several major sorties into the Port Moresby area. During the 3 days of fighting, our fighters made amazing gains against the enemy. We believed we were close to cracking this hard nut. On June 1st, 18 bombers from Rabaul, accompanied by 13 fighters from Leh and 11 from Rabaul, attempted a decisive strike on this most important enemy bastion. We did not believe that the Allies would be able to field a large group of fighters to repel the raid after the heavy losses suffered in the previous battles. However, we were wrong. About 20 fighters rushed at the Japanese air group. Once again, a one-sided fighter battle began. 7 enemy fighters were incinerated, with me managing to shoot down one of them. However, they accomplished their task by scattering our bombers and preventing them from bombing away at their targets. On the way back to Leh, one of the bombers left the formation and started twitching haphazardly in the air. I and 5 other fighters went down to cover it. This airplane had turned into a veritable ruin. Bullet and shell holes dotted the wings and fuselage so thickly that the airplane looked like a sieve. I brought my fighter to the nose of the bomber and looked into the cockpit. Even from a distance, it was obvious that the control panels and the pilot seats were drenched in blood. It was a miracle that the plane was still flying. The pilot and co-pilot were lying on the floor in pools of blood. The flight engineer, who didn't know how to do it, took over the controls of the airplane. I did not see the other 4 crew members. 2 turrets were smashed and the gunners in them were either killed or wounded. It seems that only the flight engineer, who was fighting to keep the plane in the air, seemed to be unharmed. Somehow he kept the plane flying, even though it was staggering from side to side like a drunk, and managed to make it to Leh Airfield. The man had done a magnificent job. Apparently he controlled the airplane by remembering the actions of the pilots he had seen during the flights. This is extremely difficult, even almost impossible for a person who has no flight training, and if you remember that the bomber was severely damaged, then impossible in principle. And now, when the plane reached Leh, the flight engineer almost lost everything he had achieved. He managed to keep the bomber in the air, but to land it, smoothly reducing altitude and speed, while accurately leaving the strip he could no longer. The damaged airplane circled slowly over the runway, descending more and more as the engineer looked at the narrow runway below him. No one could help the unfortunate man sitting at the controls. We approached the bomber and tried to bring it in for a landing, but as soon as the engineer took his eyes off the control panel, the airplane began to lurch dangerously. Finally, it lost speed and plummeted downward. There was no point for him to stay in the air, as the fuel was running low. The bomber described a circle over the water, jerked sharply to the side on a turn, and began to come into the runway. I held my breath. He couldn't land. Losing speed, the plane jerked and began to corkscrew. It could have crashed at any moment. But then a miracle happened. The pilot struggled to his feet. His blood-stained face was as white as chalk. He literally collapsed onto the flight engineer's back. In the critical moments of landing, he managed to push the wheel forward, and the plane regained speed. Having released the wheels and flaps, the bomber slammed onto the runway. A cloud of dust kicked up, and the bomber was dragged skidding. In an instant, it smashed 2 fighters into splinters, jumped up and stopped, breaking in half. We landed right after it and approached the wreckage, which for some reason didn't catch fire. The pilot, who only by an effort of will had gotten back to his feet a minute ago, was unconscious again. The co-pilot was dead. The flight engineer, who had dragged the wounded man home, was so badly wounded in the legs that he had to be carried out of the airplane. Both bombardiers were badly wounded. One of them had the bone of a broken arm pierced through the skin. Both were covered with blood from head to toe. The 2 gunners also had multiple wounds and were covered in blood. However, they held on to their machine guns with a dead grip. For the first time we saw with our own eyes the terrible power of the guns and machine guns of our fighters. We had never before come face to face with death. Those men who died in the blazing airplanes were far away from us. A man either went back or he didn't. And now we saw for ourselves what that looked like. The fighter sorties continued, and in the next 2 days we shot down 3 more fighters. But no one in Leh suspected that our continued victories paled in comparison to the crushing defeat suffered by the Japanese carrier group off Midway on June 5th. We knew the battle had taken place because Tokyo had announced a major victory for our fleet. The imperial rate called our own losses insignificant for the first time, however. We had a suspicion that the reports were inaccurate. The reason was simple. We knew that the landing on Midway and its capture was contemplated. If our fleet withdrew without landing a landing force, then something unforeseen had happened. For a very long time we did not know that our 4 largest and most powerful aircraft carriers had perished along with 280 airplanes and most of the pilots. Thousands of sailors who made up the crews of the sunken ships also died. From June 5th to June 15th, there was a strange lull on the New Guinea front which was broken only once when enemy bombers attacked Leh on June 9th. I added 2 more B-26s to my account, but on June 17th the fighting resumed with even greater fury. It was a lucky day for our fighters, as 21 Zeros managed to suddenly attack 3 groups of enemy fighters. We attacked the first group of 12 fighters by diving on them with the whole group, and the enemy formation immediately collapsed. I shot down 1 airplane and 5 more pilots achieved victories. The remaining 6 enemy fighters went into a dive and escaped. After gaining altitude, we attacked another group of 12 fighters from the sun side. Again, we struck quite suddenly and shot down 3 airplanes in one run. I gained my second victory of the day. The third wave of enemy planes appeared. Barely we finished diving after hitting the second. About 25 fighters flew in as we split into 2 groups. 11 Zero spiked towards the gaining height of the enemy, and the rest engaged in a battle on the horizon. The formation instantly broke up, and a frantic scramble began over the Port Moresby Air Base. The enemy planes were new model P-39s, faster and more maneuverable than the old ones. I attacked 1 fighter, but to my surprise it managed to dodge every time I opened fire. There was an incredible merry-go-round in the sky. The pilot of the Aerocobra skillfully performed turns, loops, Immelmans, dives, barrel rolls and spirals. He was an excellent pilot, and if he had a better airplane, he might have emerged victorious from this fight. But I inexorably shortened the distance between the planes and found myself on his tail at a distance of only 20 yards. 2 short cannon bursts ended the chase, and the Aerocobra burst into flames. This was my 3rd victory of the day. The 4th, which I won almost immediately, was rather ridiculous. EP-39 appeared directly in front of me, its pilot concentrating all his attention on the Zero, which was trying to get away from him with a candle. The American was firing at him, but he was right in my sights. I put about 200 bullets from both machine guns into it. The fighter tried to dodge with a barrel roll. I was out of cannon shells, so I put a second machine gun burst into his belly. But the Cobra was still holding on, and the third round hit the cockpit so that it spattered splinters. I saw the pilot hunch forward on the control panel. The P-39 went into a corkscrew and then went into a dive and crashed into the ground at tremendous speed, exploding in the middle of the jungle. 4 enemy fighters in one day. To me it was a record, and it was a component of the greatest defeat suffered by the enemy at the hands of the Leh Air Regiment. Our pilots claimed to have reliably destroyed 19 enemy fighters in the air that day. On the way back to the airfield, Yonekawa went out of formation. He threw the plane up, then spiraled back down, writing wild loops. Yonekawa was literally tumbling through the sky, circling my fighter. I realized it all when he came right up to my plane and, smiling triumphantly, pointed 2 fingers. Yonekawa was no longer a green rookie. He now had 3 enemy planes to his credit. He was bursting with pride. He flew upside down, waving both arms in the cockpit. Then Yonekawa flew above, below, and even described a wide loop around my plane. He was like an overexcited child. As he flew close to me, Yonekawa clutched the control stick between his knees. Still smiling, he waved the ration box at me and began to eat. His joy was contagious. I gave him 4 thumbs up and then uncorked a bottle of soda. He took his out of the ration box and we drank to each other. But our victories on that momentous day did not end there. Barely had our planes been refueled and rearmed when the observer's message came in. 10 B-26s were heading for our airfield. They couldn't have picked a worse time, as 19 Zeros took off before the marauders even approached Leh. We did not manage to shoot down any, but damaged most of them, forcing them to throw their bombs haphazardly. During the chase, 10 P-39 fighters came to the rescue of the bombers and intercepted us over Cape Ward Hunt. As a result, 1 Aerocobra was shot down. In the evening, celebrations began at Leh for the amazing victory. All the pilots got extra cigarettes, the mechanics crowded around to share our joy. And then came even better news. All of us got 5 days vacation in Rabaul. The shouts of joy of the pilots made the surrounding jungle shudder. Not only was I alone tired from the daily combat sorties, but my mechanics wanted a few days of quiet time to work on my fighter. They showed me the bullet holes in the planes and fuselage, and I got a twinge inside when I saw the chain of holes running straight behind the cockpit. I missed death by 6 inches. In 1942, none of our fighters had armor protecting the pilot. The Zeros also did not have the self-sealing tanks that were on American fighters. Enemy pilots soon discovered that a line of 12.7mm machine guns on the Zero's fuel tanks would immediately set a Japanese fighter on fire. Despite this, none of the Japanese pilots flew with a parachute in those days. In the West, this was completely misinterpreted. They said that the Japanese command did not care about our lives, and Japanese pilots were considered expendable, cannon fodder, not human beings. This is very far from the truth. Each man was given a parachute, and the decision to leave them on the ground was made by the pilots themselves, not by the higher headquarters. Moreover, the command persuaded us, although not directly ordered, to put on parachutes during sorties. At some airfields, commanders directly ordered to do so, and pilots simply had no other choice but to take these heavy satchels with them. Very often, however, they did not fasten the straps and used the parachute only as a seat cushion. We saw little use for parachutes. Rather, they only hindered us. During the battle, it was difficult to move your arms and legs quickly if you were wearing this harness. There was another good reason not to wear parachutes in combat. At that time, most of the fights with enemy fighters took place over enemy territory. Therefore, it was not even a question of jumping out with a parachute, as it meant almost inevitable capture. One could not find the word prisoner in the Japanese military regulations or in the traditional samurai code of Bushido. There were no prisoners in the Japanese army. No fighter pilot who possessed even a shred of courage would allow himself to be taken prisoner. It was simply unthinkable. Nevertheless, it was very unpleasant to look at bullet holes coming within inches of your seat. In the evening, I received confirmations of my 4 victories in the day's battles. This was not unique to the Imperial Navy. I knew a dozen other naval aviators, who had achieved the same or even surpassed this achievement. My number of victories now reached 43. Nishizawa, who became Japan's top ace with just over 100 aircraft shot down, set a record over Guadalcanal on August 7th when he shot down 6 American naval fighters. A year later, naval aviator First Class Kenji Okabe shot down 7 aircraft in a single day in a series of engagements over Rabaul F-4F Wildcat fighters, TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, and SBD Dauntless SBD dive bombers. However, almost all the pilots who achieved these outstanding results were later killed in action. I know of only 2 exceptions, myself and Nishizawa, but even Devil did not live to see the end of the war. He died in October 1944 over Cebu Island in the Philippines without managing to fire a single shot. Several Hellcat fighters intercepted an unarmed DC-3 transport plane carrying Nishizawa and several other pilots and shot it down. So met his ignominious end the best Japanese ace. In the evening I received an order to report to the commander of the airbase, which was quite unusual. In the room of Captain First Rank Saito, I saw his deputy Lieutenant Captain Nakajima and Lieutenant Sasai, who had also been summoned. Both senior officers looked very sullen. Captain First Rank Saito said, "I am still in doubt whether it is wise to bring you this news, and I am only doing so on the direct advice of Lieutenant Commander Nakajima, although it is a very unpleasant task for me." At the beginning of the month I asked the High Command in Tokyo to reward Lieutenant Sasai for his exceptionally skillful leadership of the squadron in combat. At the same time, I requested that Sakai be rewarded for his outstanding achievements in combat, which made him the best ace in the Imperial Navy. However, both requests went unfulfilled. Tokyo is unwilling to set a precedent. There has never been a living hero in our history, Saito emphasized. Apparently, Tokyo is determined not to change this tradition now. He added bitterly, "They refuse to even give you a medal or promote you to officer." I did not dare to inform you about this for fear that you will begin to criticize the actions of the High Command. But for me personally, it is extremely important that you know that I, as your commander, recognize your merits and appreciate your tireless efforts. Then Lieutenant Commander Nakajima spoke. The Navy has always had a tradition, right or wrong, of awarding and promoting only posthumously. Of course, you will not like that tradition at this time. I want you to know that Captain First Rank Saito has requested the rank of Lieutenant Commander for Lieutenant Sasai and the rank of Ensign for Sakai. Sasai replied without hesitation, "I cannot express to you how grateful I am for your concern and efforts on my behalf. However, I must add that neither Sakai nor I are upset with Tokyo's decision. I see no reason why we should hold a grudge. This is my personal opinion, but I am convinced, and I speak also on behalf of Sakai, that our achievements and victories do not belong to us alone. Without my wingmen who have my back, without the hard work of the ground staff, we could not have accomplished anything. I am satisfied with how our unit is performing as a whole, and I feel no need for personal reward. Although I am quite honored by what you have been willing to do for us." Sasai said exactly what I myself wished to express, so I only nodded in agreement. The Navy had stubbornly stuck to its policy of refusing to reward individual accomplishments, almost to the very end of the war. There was only one exception to this rule, when, as early as March 1945, Admiral Somu Toyoda, commander of the Combined Fleet, honored Marine Airman First Class Soichi Sudita and me in an order for an outstanding number of air victories. I should add that at that time I already held the rank of ensign. But these awards were meaningless. The greatest aces of our fleet, Nishizawa, Ota, Sasai and others, were dead by then. In June, we began to meet an increasing number of enemy fighters and bombers. We were informed that the enemy was building up his air force in the area, so we must now conduct fighter raids in larger forces. It became clear that we would need every Zero available in Leh. Meanwhile, the enemy was building more and more airfields in the jungle surrounding Port Moresby. Our bomber raids in return became more frequent and powerful, but the enemy fighters met each raid and acted decisively and aggressively. June 17th, 12-0, escorted 18 bombers to Port Moresby and drove away 7 American interceptors trying to attack the group. The bombers struck the dock area and sank an 8,000-ton transport standing in the harbour. 7 American fighters chased our group all the way to Cape Ward Hunt, but had no success. The next day 9 of our bombers and 9 fighters attacked Kido at Riscar Bay, a new enemy base just north of Port Moresby where the fighters were based. 10 enemy interceptors attacked 18 Japanese aircraft, and again to no avail, although they lost 2 aircraft in the process. On June 24th, I returned to Lae after a rest at Rabaul, and the next morning as part of a group of 21 fighters went on a raid to Port Moresby. The fighting was fierce, and I shot down 1 airplane out of 11 which our pilots reported destroying. The next morning 19 bombers flew from Rabaul to Port Moresby. They were escorted by 11 fighters. 12 enemy planes intercepted them, but the Zeros shot down 3 enemy planes. This was the last June raid. The next day a tropical downpour hit New Guinea. Rain whipped not only on our airfields but also on Allied airfields. Our successes in April, May and June were partly due to the fine flying weather, which stood nearly all day. In the afternoon quite often clouds gathered, but by this time, that is about 4 p.m, we were already on the ground. In the evening there came some fierce squalls which raged all night. But this was more of a gift than an inconvenience, because they prevented the enemy from carrying out night bombardments more regularly, and we were able to sleep almost daily. In July the weather changed dramatically. In the evenings the squalls no longer came, now the sky remained perfectly clear day and night. That's when the enemy bombers appeared. They came almost every night, and the bombs fell on our heads continuously. Mitchells and Marauders relentlessly bombed the airfield and bombarded everything. We were completely helpless against these attacks. Even if the runway had been long enough to conduct night flights, it is extremely doubtful that the Zero could have made any progress at night. So we stayed on the ground, hiding in shelters and cursing the Americans. The technicians and mechanics suffered the most. They did not have the opportunity to participate in raids and see flame-engulfed enemy planes flying to the ground. Instead, they had to work almost around the clock to keep a handful of fighters in serviceable condition. And now they were also deprived of the opportunity to sleep, as the power of enemy night raids was increasing. The enemy made a particularly strong raid on our airfield in the early morning of July 2nd. The air alarm woke us up before dawn. We hastily put on flight suits and ran to the airfield. But no sooner had we reached the runway than we heard the roar of engines accompanied by the bursting of the first bombs. All pilots rushed to the nearest shelter. There was no time to hide in the crevices, and we jumped into the neighbouring craters. The bombers could be easily distinguished against the starry sky. They were Mitchells and Marauders flying at an altitude of no more than 600 feet. The ghostly lights of the exhausts flickered in the black sky. However, they did not seem beautiful at all, as we huddled in the bottom of the funnels. Having used up their bombs, the planes made another run, flying at treetop level. They bombarded the runway and every building they could see. We hid in the craters again, feeling disgusted. The enemy bombers poured a real shower of bullets on the airfield. By some miracle, none of the pilots were wounded. Then the Allies withdrew to work at the other end of the airfield. I crawled out of the crater and ran to the command post. No time should have been wasted crossing the airfield. Since all our fighters were on the ground, the next wave of bombers could well appear in the next minute, and a bomb crater is not the most reliable shelter during aerial bombardment. The command post was still intact, but now enemy bombers were circling around, firing machine guns at the tower and the hut. The sailors built a berm around the command post and returned a barrage of fire from their machine guns, but succeeded only in expending ammunition. They knew nothing of the rules of firing at airplanes, and their trails glittered harmlessly in the sky behind the bombers. This complete lack of marksmanship surprised me. I completely forgot my desire for cover and ran toward the machine gunners. I ran up to one of the anti-aircraft gunners and tugged at his sleeve, telling him that I would point. However, the sailor clung to his machine gun and refused to leave, shouting that he had no such orders. I did not waste time arguing with him, but simply threw him off the seat with a blow. He got to his feet swearing, but another pilot standing nearby pulled him aside and took the ammo ribbons. The sailor ran away in a rage. The next instant a second wave of 6 B-26s attacked the airfield. I pressed the throttle and held it down, watching the track glittering in the air. Marauder skipped right over my head, and I spent a jet of fire on the fuselage from nose to tail. But the bomber didn't even flinch and headed for my gun position. The nose gunner returned fire. It was my first fight on the ground with an airplane flying directly at me, and I was afraid that its bullets would tear me to pieces. But a more frightening picture flashed through my mind, bombs whistling down and bursting right on my firing position. Fear took over all other emotions. I dropped the gun and ran with all my legs to the sandbag shelter behind me. I didn't even run the whole way, but overcame the last meters with a desperate leap, literally flying into the shelter. For a few seconds I sat there feeling like a real idiot and a coward. The B-26 rumbled overhead without dropping any bombs. I berated my body, which had succumbed to panic, and returned to the gun. Gradually I stopped shivering and came to my senses. I sat down again on the gunner's seat and swore that now I would not run like a rabbit. The bombers came back. They were flying at an altitude of only 150 feet, and so the roar of the engines was deafening, hurting my ears. They looked like huge black shadows leaping out of the gloom and spewing flames from their machine guns. The shuddering exhausts illuminated them with a ghostly blue halo. I met the approaching bomber with a burst, continuing to fire while it was in my sights. A thin trickle of smoke appeared, but the plane continued to fly quietly and disappeared into the distance, never leaving the formation. The enemy practiced bombing and shelling for more than an hour, and then flew away from Leh with impunity before dawn. Not a single plane was shot down, although anti-aircraft guns and machine guns fired more than 1,000 shells and bullets. The pilots were so demoralized by this attack that even after the bomb bursts subsided, not one ran to the fighters to take off and catch up with the enemy as we had wished before. Most of the airfield buildings were burning. Deep craters turned the runway into something horrible. It would have prevented us from taking off, even if we had wanted to. It seemed impossible, but the 20 fighter planes parked on either side of the runway survived. They only had bullet and shrapnel holes. We gathered at the command post to receive new orders. The pilots were shocked and furious at the raid that had come upon us. One of the pilots who had recently arrived in Leh, Marine Airman Second Class Mature Suits, was particularly raging. He vowed that he would shoot down a bomber during the next raid, even though he would have to ram the enemy to do so. At that moment, however, no one paid attention to his promise. Even before the bombers flew away, almost 200 men spilled out onto the airfield with shovels and hand rollers and began filling in craters and removing rocks and pieces of iron from the runway. Suddenly, several ordinaries rushed in from the command post, hysterically yelling another raid is about to begin. Over 100 airplanes are approaching the airfield, 100 airplanes. It was simply an unbelievable figure. We had never heard of an attack of such strength before. There was panic among the staff officers, and then came the order to put all available airplanes in the air. We ran to the fighter planes and began to taxi to the start as soon as the engines were warmed up. The runway had been brought to a relatively usable condition. As the Zeros were getting ready to take off, officers began to jump out of the command center, waving their arms frantically. Shouting something, they ran along the strip. Then they began to fold their hands in a cross, demanding to turn off the engines. When they ran up to the fighters, they explained the alert has been cancelled. Our observers have made a mistake, one of the officers laughed nervously. Those 100 airplanes turned out to be a flock of migratory birds after that. Everyone laughed. The whole episode seemed ridiculous after the tension we had experienced. We had breakfast, settled around the command post to immediately take off at the threat of a new raid. The enemy today decided not to give us a rest. We were still eating when the Ordinarians came running with a message from Salamoa. They reported that 6 B-17s were flying toward our base. We didn't delay a second. In an instant, the dishes flew in different directions and we ran toward the fighters. Salamaua was only a few minutes' flight from Leh, and the bombers would soon descend on us. But I didn't manage to take off. The other pilots were already racing down the runway, and I sat in the cockpit cursing the engine, which refused to start. I tried the starter again and again, but the engine was silent. Frustrated, I climbed out of the airplane and just looked after the fighters flying away. After that, I went across the airfield to the shelters. Lieutenant Captain Nakajima was waving his arms furiously, shouting something. He was pointing up into the sky now and then. I was about 20 yards from the shelters when the whistle of falling bombs ripped through the air like a giant scourge. The last few feet just flew through the air, and I collapsed onto the back of a man crouched on the ground in a gap. And in that very second, the world seemed to explode. There was a deafening rumble of thunder and the ground beneath my feet shimmered. I felt something squeeze my body, the pressure was terrible, and then everything went black. I couldn't see or hear anything. I felt like I had been ripped out of this world and thrown into an unknown void. I tried to move my arms and legs, but without success. I felt paralyzed. Whether it was seconds or minutes, I cannot say, but then I heard a voice calling me from somewhere far away. It was Lieutenant Captain Nakajima. Sakai. Sakai. Where are you? There was a brief silence. And then the shout again, where are you? Where's Sakai gone? Look for him, damn it. I tried to shout back. Although I thought I was shouting, strangely enough, I couldn't hear my own voice. My mouth, my lips didn't even move. Something heavy was pressing on my chin. Nakajima's voice came again, somehow dim and distant. He must have fallen asleep. Look for him. Don't waste a second. Fallen asleep. Of course. I opened my eyes slightly. Darkness. Then I was overwhelmed by terror. I felt I was suffocating. The sand was choking me. I tried to get up, but I couldn't even move. The horror just overwhelmed me. Nakajima's voice came again. Now it sounded a little louder. Dig with anything you can find. Hurry, dig with sticks. Dig with your bare hands if there's nothing else. Hurry. Then some scraping was heard, shovels blasting sand. I waited, trying not to squirm. Soon they found me. A hand went over my face, stroked my cheek, and raked sand from my mouth and nose. Sunlight hit my eyes as my rescuers dug me up and dragged me outside. I turned out to not be the only one buried alive. At least 10 people were trapped when one of the crevices collapsed from a nearby bomb burst. But not a single person got a scratch. We were covered from head to toe in sand, which fortunately absorbed all the shock wave as the crevice crumbled. The command post was blown to splinters. The smoking crater beside it showed that only luck had spared it from a direct hit. Most of the planes still on the runway were blown to bits. The punctured fuel tanks of several machines were ablaze. It was nearly an hour before the fighters that had managed to take off returned to the base. The pilots were grim. The 6 flying fortresses had jokingly beaten back all their onslaughts. It took 2 days to get the base in order after the July 2nd raid, but on July 4th we were ready to retaliate by striking Port Moresby. It was still July 3rd on the American calendar, but we hoped to help them organize an Independence Day celebration with a small fireworks display. The 21 Zeros flew toward Port Moresby, where 20 enemy fighters were already happily waiting for them. We attacked the Allied planes, preventing them from completing their dive. Our pilots said that 9 fighters shot down reliably and another 3 probably. We still had quite a long way to go to Leh when I noticed a cloud of black smoke floating in the wind. When the airbase appeared, it was clear that the smoke was coming from the burning airfield structures. Tongues of flame were shooting up into the air, and clouds of thick black smoke were billowing over the jungle and the coast. The reason was quite clear. While we were away, enemy bombers had set fire to our gasoline storage tank. We were still coming in for a landing when suddenly 7 MEMS Roders appeared over the jungle. We noticed the bombers only when they were over the airfield. Their black bombs flashed through the air, raising fountains of fire and dust high above the runway. We rushed in pursuit. A few more fighters managed to take off from the airfield, so more than 26 Zero rushed in pursuit of 7 fleeing B-26. For a few moments there was complete chaos in the air. The planes scrambled randomly, trying to avoid collisions. Often they were no more than a foot apart. One fighter that had flown out of Leh separated from the general group. Zero sped past the bombers, then turned sharply toward them and lunged straight at the lead bomber at a terrible speed. What we first took for a daring frontal attack turned into something terrible. The Japanese pilot didn't even try to open fire. He intended to ram the enemy. The planes were approaching at a combined speed of over 600 mph, and everything happened in a split second. Zero skidded close to the right propeller of Marauder, and his wing cut down the keel of the bomber. At first, the Zero flew perfectly straight with no visible damage. Then it began to spin, gradually losing altitude, and crashed into the sea at high speed. A few seconds later, the B-26, which had lost its keel, began to stagger from side to side, flipped over on its back, and also crashed into the water, exploding with a blinding flash. Immediately, 6 fighters poured gun and machine gun fire on another B-26, and in less than 5 minutes it too disappeared into the waves. The other 5 bombers escaped. Returning to Leh, we found out that the pilot who rammed the Marauder was the same pilot who swore to take the enemy plane with him on July 2nd. Sutsu carried out his threat. On July 6th, we attacked Port Moresby again. 15 fighters escorted 21 bombers. Our pilots reported that they shot down 3 enemy fighters. But from July 7th to 10, it was the enemy's turn. For 3 nights in a row we hid in shelters like rats in holes. Something nightmarish was going on in Leh at night. Bombs were bursting, machine gun bursts were tearing up the ground, fountains of fire and smoke were exploding, airplanes were burning, buildings were collapsing, hundreds of bomb craters were appearing. No one doubted that the enemy intended to turn the Leh airbase into smoking ruins. But despite the strongest attacks, he never managed to achieve his main goal, to prevent our fighters from flying. On July 11th, we conducted another major bomber raid on Port Moresby. 12 fighters escorted 21 bombers coming from Rabaul. We were still flying toward the enemy base when LT Sasai spotted 6 B-17s heading to bomb our airfield. He left the formation, taking 5 more fighters with him. Sasai made a serious mistake. He signaled Nishizawa, Ota and me to follow him. After that, 6 fighters attacked the flying fortresses with a series of runs. Once again, the fortresses proved to be very resilient, just as their name implied. We damaged 3 bombers, but failed to shoot down any of them. But their gunners showed that they had learned a thing or two. 1-0 went down in flames. The rest of the fighters, including my own, were pierced by enemy bullets. With only 6 cover fighters, the bombers attacking Port Moresby were scattered by enemy fighters. Their bombs therefore fell anywhere but on target, and enemy installations were hardly damaged. Sasai was severely reprimanded for leaving the bombers with such a weak escort. He did not even try to justify himself and accepted the reprimand in silence. And he had nothing to justify himself. He broke the main rule of fighter escort: never leave bombers without protection. However, the pilots of the squadron sympathized with Sasai. The B-17s have always been a painful thorn in our side. Their ability to easily repel attacks baffled and angered us. On July 21st, we began a new phase of fighter operations when a Japanese infantry division landed at Buna, 110 miles south of Leh. Our troops immediately moved inland in a desperate attempt to make their way through the jungle to Port Moresby. On a map, it is very easy to make such a crossing. Buna was very close to Port Moresby, separated only by the neck of the Papua Peninsula. But maps of a jungle-covered island are very different from the stuffy hell that exists under the thick cover of foliage. The Japanese High Command made a grave and even fatal mistake in sending our troops to attack Port Moresby by land. Before the battle was over, Japan had suffered one of its most tragic and humiliating defeats. The Owen Stanley Range is almost as high as the formidable Alps. To call the jungle that covers the mountainsides simply dense vegetation is to greatly embellish the picture. The abundance of plants there is incredible. If there is no swamp, mire, thick, slippery layer of humus under your feet, then you have to tread on razor-sharp stones. Treacherous scree. A variety of vines, myriad insects, terrible heat and disease literally mowed people down. Crossing the alpine glaciers was a simple task compared to the deadly risks of trying to make your way through the jungle of the Owen Stanley Range. Getting supplies to the troops as they plunged into the jungle quagmire proved unthinkable. Any minor wound or scratch in the heat and humidity turned into a festering ulcer. Sweat oozed from every pore. Weapons rusted instantly, Clothes turned into rags and feet were cut on rocks and razor-sharp grass stalks. For months our soldiers fought hard against the worst enemy they had ever met. This enemy did not fire cannons or machine guns or lay mines. However, he swallowed hundreds of men in a single movement and never let go of his victims. By superhuman efforts, several platoons managed to get within a few miles of the cherished goal of Port Moresby, but even they were met with failure. The division simply melted into the jungle without a trace, from which there was no escape. Most of the soldiers died of exhaustion. The attempt to advance overland was a gesture of desperation. Initially, our High Command had planned to land a large landing force at Port Moresby. However, this operation was thwarted after the May 7th to 8th battle in the Coral Sea, when 2 Japanese aircraft carriers met 2 American carriers in the first naval battle in history, in which ships of both sides did not fire a single shot at the enemy. Each formation used their own airplanes to strike. We won the battle, however the enemy achieved their objective. The landing operation was cancelled. After our troops landed in Buna, the headquarters in Rabaul ordered to stop the attacks on Port Moresby and to provide permanent air cover for the bridgehead. The landing at Buna was part of a larger operation that was doomed to failure before it had even begun. Not only did the jungle present a totally insurmountable obstacle, our soldiers suffered constantly from the fact that the command did not pay proper attention to supply problems and did not really understand them. These shortcomings, as well as the brilliant actions of the enemy from the very beginning of the operation, made the defeat of the Japanese inevitable. Simultaneously with the landing at Buna, a detachment of Marines landed on the extreme eastern tip of New Guinea. Working day and night, the men constructed an airstrip at Rabi, from which it was intended to provide air cover for the advance across New Guinea from the Buna bridgehead. Strangely enough, the enemy did not bomb the airfield at Rabi during construction, but was satisfied with photographs taken by reconnaissance planes. However, as soon as the airfield was completed, the enemy troops launched a surprise attack in large forces and quickly crushed the Japanese garrison. It was a brilliant move. We built the airfield, but the Americans and Australians began to use it. But this airfield was not enough for them. It became obvious that the Allies were building up their air force to completely block Lae and Rabaul. Their engineers built airfields in the jungle with astonishing speed. Medium bombers and fighters flew to the new sites, while work was still going on there. The raids on Lae continued, involving more and more aircraft. Rarely a night passed without the Mitchells and Marauders showing up to bomb and strafe everything they wanted. During the day, our commanders shuffled and reshuffled the available 20 to 30 fighters to keep 6 Zeros over Buna at all times, as well as having a duty wing on standby to cover the airfield. Air cover of Buna we could not provide, but still our fighters did not allow the Allies to strike in large forces and destroy the structures on the shore. I received a real shock during the first flight to Buna. I had seen many landing operations from the air before, but never had I seen such a pathetic attempt to supply an entire infantry division. Soldiers scurried along the beach, carrying crates in their arms. There were only 2 small transports off the coast, with 1 patrolman as cover. They were delivering new supplies. Covering the beachhead proved to be a more difficult task than we had anticipated. Only on cloudy days, when the whole sky was covered with dense clouds, we got a relative respite. On July 22nd, by a group of 6 Zero, we described in an empty sky. At least it seemed so to us. Thick clouds hung overhead at 7,000 feet. Quite suddenly, a series of explosions shook the coast. Columns of fire and smoke rose into the sky. A few seconds later, thick black smoke billowed from a warehouse a few hundred yards from the water. No airplanes could be seen. Either they had dropped their bombs through the clouds with amazing marksmanship, which was quite improbable, or 1 or more planes had surfaced from the clouds, dropped their bombs, and retreated again under the protection of the grey mass, never to be seen by us. The second supposition proved correct. A few seconds later, I spotted a tiny black dot under the very clouds far to the southeast. We turned around and chased the departing airplane. As we flew closer, we recognized an old buddy, a twin-engine Lockheed Hudson. We were about a mile away from it when we spotted it. The bomber pecked its nose and raced along the shore, trying to get to Rabi. Its speed was high and almost equal to that of our fighters. I dumped the outboard tank and pushed the throttle all the way up, turning on the engine afterburner. Being behind on the left, I gave a burst of all cannons and machine guns from a range of 600 yards. I hoped that the Hudson would begin to swerve and allow me to close the distance. What happened was simply amazing. As soon as I started firing, the Hudson went up steeply with a right turn and rushed back at full speed right at me. I was so surprised that I sat motionless in the cockpit for a few seconds. But then all the Hudson's course machine guns opened fire. Our Zeros darted around, dodging and diving in all directions. Nothing like this had ever happened before. I saw Lieutenant Sasai out of the corner of my eye. His jaw dropped at the unexpected bravery of the enemy pilot. 1-0, piloted by Nishizawa, who could not be impressed by anything, stopped turning and ducked under the bomber. Flames danced on the barrels of its guns, and then we were struck a second time. The Hudson made a sharp turn. Never before had I seen a twin-engine bomber turn so easily. Nishizawa's guns ripped through the empty air. The remaining pilots, including myself, mobbed the Hudson, and all of us failed to get a single hit. The bomber spun and spun like crazy, its top gunner continuously fired at our fighters. The Zero pilots went into a frenzy. Our formation fell apart and each pilot attacked the Hudson on his own. I made at least 4 runs and had to stop attacking because other pilots were rushing at the enemy, risking ramming my wingmen. For almost 10 minutes we chased the Hudson, showering it with jets of lead and steel. Finally, a heavy explosion blew his tail turret apart. I saw the gunner splash his arms and fall. Now that his machine guns were no longer in the way, I approached to a distance of 20 yards and pressed the throttles, aiming at the right wing. A couple seconds later, flames appeared and spread to the left wing as well. The pilot stayed with the ship. The altitude was too low to parachute out. Hudson was losing speed rapidly and gliding down toward the jungle. Trees shaved off both burning wings. The fuselage, which also dragged a tail of flame behind it, dived into the dense foliage like a red-hot steel ingot. Then came a violent explosion, a column of smoke rising upward. The day was full of surprises. When we turned back to Leh to resume patrolling, 5 Airacobras tried to suddenly attack our formation. The enemy planes flew in a column over the water, trying to gain altitude quickly and take us by surprise. I was the first to spot the enemy group. I turned sharply and spiked at the Airacobras, aiming directly at the lead plane. All 5 P-39s sputtered in different directions and rushed away. Having lost the advantage of surprise, they were unwilling to compete with me, and the 5 Zeros at my back. The Americans did not at all like the prospect of a battle in which they had no advantage of altitude. Gaining speed on the dive, I was soon inside the enemy group. 2 fighters panicked and disappeared into the low clouds. Another disappeared in a rain squall, and the 4th simply vanished into thin air. I could clearly see only 1 Airacobra and chased it at full speed. The American pilot was heading for the clouds, but a line ahead on the course made him change his mind. The P-39 made a left turn and spiked toward the sea. I was about 200 yards behind him. It was a new model Airacobra, which at sea level had the same speed as my fighter. But the pilot made a fatal mistake. He flew in the wrong direction. Instead of heading towards Port Moresby, he flew in the opposite direction. I still had plenty of fuel, and I wasn't about to let him go, even if I had to fly all the way to Rabaul. After a few minutes, the American pilot seemed to come to his senses and realized his mistake. He had no choice but to turn back, and his fighter made a steep left turn. It had happened many times in the past. I entered the inside of his turn, keeping just below and to the left of the American fighter. A short burst caused the Airacobra to stagger to the side, dodging my shells. I lined up on its tail, although the Airacobra was darting left and right, heading for the beach. I lost the fighter for a few seconds when he executed an absolutely insane maneuver, and the P-39 rushed toward his base, again having a several hundred-yard advantage. Even with the engine afterburner on, I couldn't close the distance. I was almost ready to give up the pursuit. If the P-39 flew in a straight line, and on the correct course, I would not be able to get into firing range. The enemy pilot chose otherwise. Instead of keeping over the sea, he flew straight toward Owen Stanley Ridge, where he was forced to gain altitude. But no P-39 had as much speed climb as the Zero. Slowly and steadily I was gaining on him. I hadn't fired yet, intending to open fire at minimum range. I had very little ammunition left after the fight with the Hudson, and could only afford 1 or 2 short bursts. 50 yards. Then they were down to 40. Then down to 30. I put my finger on the trigger and took careful aim. But I had no sooner fired a single shot than the pilot jumped out of the Aerocobra with a parachute. The plane was flying less than 150 feet above the ground, and such a jump meant certain death. I don't know of an example of a pilot being saved by jumping from less than 300 feet. By some miracle, the parachute opened a split second before the pilot hit the ground. He hit a small clearing and his fighter jet exploded a few yards in front of him. I still couldn't believe that the enemy pilot had escaped after that incredible descent. I turned back and flew over the jungle clearing again. Only the parachute was visible. The pilot had survived and was in good enough condition to immediately scoot away and hide. This was my second victory without firing a shot, and my count now totaled 49 airplanes. For the next few weeks we continued to cover the bridgehead at Buna, but in the second half of July a new and unfamiliar phase of the war began for us. We no longer flew without parachutes. Higher headquarters gave orders, and Captain First Rank Saito ordered every pilot to put on a parachute before departure. It was a strange sensation to feel the parachute satchel on the seat beneath me and its straps around my shoulders. I had never flown with one before. Equally exciting were other orders that were an ominous omen, although no one said so explicitly. We ceased offensive operations. Captain First Rank Saito ordered that henceforth no fighter aircraft should cross Owen Stanley Ridge under any pretext. Only once, July 26th, did I see Port Moresby again. We intercepted 5 marauders over Buna, and during the chase, when the bombers were trying to escape to their airfield, I shot down 2 more B-26s. These victories were confirmed by other pilots. With Sasai and Endo as wingmen, I chased the rest of the bombers and crossed the ridge, disobeying orders. I shelled another bomber but didn't see it go down, so victory was only considered probable. That was the last time I flew over an enemy base. The situation on the front was changing rapidly. By the end of the first week of August, we were fighting in conditions with which we had not previously been familiar. The Americans had landed a large landing force on the island of Guadalcanal,